On this Good Friday morning, I want us to reflect on Jesus' final prayer on the cross and the meaning of his cruel and torturous death. For several weeks now, Reverend Bob and I have been reflecting on the last words of Jesus from the cross. First, we heard the words of forgiveness when Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they do." Then we heard Jesus' promise to the repentant thief, saying, "Today you will be with me in paradise." Next, we heard Jesus' love as he provided for his mother Mary. Then we heard Jesus' cry from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" Next, we reflected on the words, "I thirst." Last week, we heard a powerful message from Judas's perspective, what the words, "It is finished," meant. And finally, this morning, we look at Jesus' final words, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." And having said this, the Bible tells us Jesus breathed his last. The temple curtain was torn in two from top to the bottom, this curtain dividing the place called the Holy of Holies. No one could enter this place. Only once a year, the great high priest was permitted by Jewish law to enter the place to make a sacrifice for the sins of the people. But when Jesus cried out, "It is finished," the curtain was no longer necessary because Jesus Christ had become the sacrifice. Having accomplished everything, he cried out for all to hear, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." All through his passion, his suffering, Jesus obeyed. He drank the cup which he prayed be taken from him. Jesus willingly, intentionally committed himself to God's plan. In these last words, Jesus was announcing his own faith and trust in God's plan. He was obedient to the will of his Father, and he trusted what God had in store for him. It's easy for us to dwell on the horrors of Jesus' death. But in these last words, Jesus calls out to us to follow him, to look beyond the temporary pain and trauma, and to put our faith in God as he did. The cross isn't the end. The cross isn't where defeat happened. The cross is where victory happened. The cross is where Jesus won. The cross is where Jesus said, "I've accomplished what I've come to do." We can't expect to follow his example literally, but Jesus does call us to take up our crosses, whatever shape they may come, and take them and follow him. How much do we truly trust in God's plan for our lives? We don't really, but as we reflect on Jesus' final words, we'll see why we can trust him even when the ways look completely dark and there's no sign of hope. Jesus' final prayer and his physical suffering are answers to our confusions, to our injustices, to our sufferings. William Barclay, professor and theologian, wrote this. He said, "Jesus died with a prayer on his lip. 'Father, into your hands I commit my spirit.' That is Psalm chapter 31, verse 5, with one word added, Father." In these final words, we see that it is a prayer of communion with God. Second, a prayer of confidence in the power of God. And finally, it's a prayer of commitment to God. First, a prayer of communion. Jesus' first word from the cross was, "Father, forgive them." And he ends by saying, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit." Jesus is clear in who God is. There is an intimate knowledge of their relationship. He understands the Father's absolute love and devotion for him, and he is absolutely submitted to and loves the Father. There is communion. Secondly, Jesus' last words is a prayer of confidence in the power of God. When David wrote Psalm 31, when he penned these words, he was facing shame and death from his enemies. But he called upon God to deliver him. He called God his refuge and rock. He prayed God to rescue him speedily. Then David said, "Into your hands I commit my spirit." In other words, David was saying, "God, I am totally trusting my soul to you through all of this." And quoting from this psalm, Jesus is confessing the same. Thirdly, the final prayer of Jesus is a prayer of commitment to God. Jesus is entrusting everything to God. He is depositing his soul, his love, his life with the Father. Jesus entrusted God with his work on the cross, that God would prosper what he had accomplished. After Jesus Christ cried out, "Father, into your hands I commit my spirit," he breathed his last. He endured 6 long hours on the cross, the most cruel instrument of death. Prior to that suffering, he suffered flogging, 40 lashes minus 1. He endured beating by the soldiers. He was stripped naked. A crown of thorn was pushed onto his head. And yet, Jesus was committed. He was committed to obey fully God's purpose and plan. He could have, at any moment, stopped everything. He could have called down legions of angels to his side. He could not have died on that cross, but he did. And that should not only move us, but transform us and heal us. During Good Friday, it's easy for us to focus on the physical suffering of Jesus. It's easy to be moved emotionally because of what Jesus has endured. Remember Mel Gibson's movie, The Passion of Christ? When it first came out, there was such an outcry by both Christians and non-Christians that it was too graphic and that it glorified torture rather than Jesus. There was a lot of confusion. Many people who watched the movie were emotionally engaged. Very few people left the theaters with dry eyes. But the problem with that was that there was no real understanding of the meaning of the brutality and torture, not only among non-Christians, but Christians as well. I remember a friend telling me about these 2 guys who sat in front of her at the movie theaters watching this movie, and it was evident by the heaving of the shoulders and the hands to the face that this one gentleman was emotionally engaged and emotionally disturbed by what he saw. And at the end of the movie, the same man turned to his friends and said, "I don't get it. What happened?" And his friend said, "It's simple. He died." Clearly, not only did his friend not get it, he didn't get it either. There's a danger in talking about Jesus' suffering and to be moved by it, to be emotionally disturbed, because anybody, any human being who hears any description of torture and suffering and death is going to be moved. So what's so special about Jesus being tortured? Thousands have faced horrendous suffering all throughout history. What makes Jesus' suffering and death so special? Is it enough to be just moved emotionally? You know, when we read the gospel accounts of this story, there isn't a whole lot of details to stir us emotionally. There isn't the gory details of his suffering. It's almost as if the gospel writers didn't want us to be moved emotionally. Unless you understand who Jesus is, what he is doing, you may be moved emotionally, but being emotional isn't going to change you or heal you. It can't transform you. What transforms us is to understand who Jesus is and what his death accomplished. Jesus, the Son of God, left the glories of heaven and entered time and space, taking on the form of a human being. Eugene Peterson writes it well in his version of Philippians chapter 2. He says this, he said, "Jesus had equal status with God, but didn't think so much of himself that he clung to the advantages of that status no matter what. Not at all. When the time came, he set aside the privileges of deity and took on the status of a slave, became human. Having become human, he stayed human. It was an incredibly humbling process. He didn't claim special privileges. Instead, he lived a selfless, obedient life and then died a selfless, obedient death, and the worst kind of death at that, a crucifixion. Jesus chose out of his own will to die. He willingly chose to die. He was in control. He could have chosen not to die, but he willingly gave up his spirit for the forgiveness of our sins, for our salvation, to make a way for us to him. It's important not to be just moved emotionally because of what he suffered, but to understand what Jesus did. Now, having said that, I need to make a confession. I would not have watched Mel Gibson's movie had I known how graphic it was going to be. It actually bothers me when people, and a lot of times preachers, fill in the gap with gory details about Jesus' suffering. I actually get upset. I remember listening to one minister go on and on and on about the details of flogging and the tearing of the flesh and the details of the thorn being crushed upon his head and the bleeding and so forth. As he spoke, I got more and more upset. In fact, if I was honest, I was angry. Then, not too long after that, during my personal devotion time, this incident was brought to mind. I was reading about Jesus' death and what he endured in the book called The Ragamuffin Gospel, and I found myself weeping, actually sobbing over the cruel, horrendous suffering Jesus endured. And here's what I journaled, if you give me permission to read what I wrote. I used to be very uncomfortable when people emphasized the death of Jesus Christ and emphasized his bloody death, the torture and the beating that he suffered. I'm not quite sure why. Perhaps I was embarrassed by the expression of love, the outrageous and lavish love. Or perhaps I couldn't accept that human beings can be that cruel and evil. But this is it. This is the gospel. We are incredibly cruel and evil. We are capable and have committed horrendous acts of evil, and yet we're loved. God's love is crazy love. Yes, he died on the cross bleeding to death for me. He was in complete agony. He loves me that crazy much. Linda, stop trying to you know what I'm trying to say. Don't try to explain it away, explaining it's Jesus' separation from the Father was the cause of his angers. Yes, it is true, but I need to accept that Jesus died a bloody death for me. That's how much he loves me. Why is it that I can accept love given to me by simple things like flowers, but when the God of the universe dies naked on the cross, I'm ashamed and embarrassed? Why can't I tell the world and scream it out, yes, he died bleeding to death for me? That's how unworthy I am, but that's how much I am loved. You know, when I watched the movie The Passion of Christ, I wept. I wept because I saw in life-size form what my sins caused. I wept because I saw Jesus willingly take the beating, willingly take the lashes, willingly embrace that cross. I wept because I knew he was God. He had the power at every moment of his suffering to say enough, but he didn't. He didn't because he chose me over himself. He chose you over himself. He chose crazy love for us. This is the meaning of Jesus' death. This is why we're moved. This is why there is power in the cross. This is why we can pick up our crosses. And as we do, let us remember Jesus shouting into the presence of utter darkness, Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. Let us pray.